Masechta Chala, Perek Beis, Mishnah Aleph. Peres chutz la'aretz shenichnasu la'aretz. Produce or grain that was grown outside Eretz Yisrael that entered into Eretz Yisrael and now was made into dough there. Chayav and b'chala. The chiyuv to separate chala depends on whether the dough was in Eretz Yisrael at the time when the chiyuv of chala takes effect, which is the time when it was made into dough. Since this produce was in Eretz Yisrael at the time, it's going to be mechuyev and chala. The pasuk teaches that even produce of outside Eretz Yisrael is mechuyev and chala midiraisa if it's in Eretz Yisrael when the chiyuv of chala is chal. The chiyuv to separate chala takes effect is chal at the time of kneading the dough. Thus, the dough kneaded in Eretz Yisrael is subject to chalim and atayra, whether the grain grew in Eretz Yisrael or outside Eretz Yisrael. So, what we're saying over here is like this: the pasuk says, "El ha'aretz ashani maybe eschem shama atem chayavin bein beperis aretz bein beperis chutz la'aretz." The chiyuv of chala is when the dough is being kneaded, and whether they're from Peres Eretz Yisrael or from Peres Chutz La'aretz, at the time of the kneading of the dough, if it's in Eretz Yisrael, it's going to be mechuyev and chala. Midrabanan, however, even bread made entirely outside of Eretz Yisrael is mechuyev and chala, as we'll see later on in Perek Dalet. Yotzu mikan l'sham, if grain went out from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, the reason why we're saying mikan l'sham is because the Tanoim of the Mishnah lived in Eretz Yisrael, and they refer to Eretz Yisrael as here, and Chutz La'aretz as there. Rabbi Lezer Mechayiv, Rabbi Kiva Paiter. Rabbi Lezer says it's mechuyev and chala min atayra. Rabbi Lezer holds that grain that grows in Eretz Yisrael is mechuyev and chala, even if it was not in Eretz Yisrael at the time when the chiyuv of chala takes effect, when it was made into the dough. And Rabbi Kiva Paiter, Rabbi Kiva says you're pater. So what's the svara? So Rabbi Lezer is mechayiv because the pasuk says v'haya ba'alcholchem ilechem ha'aretz. It will be when you'll eat from the bread of the land. Bein sha'atem oichel ma'aseh ba'aretz, whether you're eating it when it's in Eretz Yisrael, bein sha'atem oichel ma'aseh b'chutz la'aretz, whether you're eating it outside Eretz Yisrael, being that this is the bread of the land, chayv v'chala, therefore it's going to be chayv v'chala. Rabbi Kiva Paiter, Rabbi Kiva says, you're pater. Rabbi Kiva holds that the place where the grain grows is not a factor in creating the chayv v'chala, rather it depends on where it becomes a dough. Since it was made into dough outside Eretz Yisrael, there's no chiyuv to separate chala from this dough. According to Rabbi Kiva, what's the svara? Because shama, right, because the pasuk says, v'haya b'acholchem ilechem ha'aretz, the shama mashma le'miyuta. I'm sorry, the pasuk says al ashani maybe eschem shama. That's where you're going to be mechuyev and chala. Shama is specifically in that place. Shama atem chayavim, vein atem chayavim v'chutz la'aretz. You're mechuyev dafka over there and not in chutz la'aretz. Aval pisha atem oichel melechem ha'aretz, even though you'll be eating from the lechem ha'aretz, which was the pasuk that Rabbi Lezer was referring to. The halacha is like Rabbi Kiva. Mishnah Beis. Things are starting to get a little more interesting here, like this. Afar chutz la'aretz shababa svina la'aretz. If soil from outside Eretz Yisrael came on a boat into a river or lake inside Eretz Yisrael, chayiv v'maisus b'shvius. The produce that grows in that soil in the boat is mechuyev in maisus and shvius. This is because the produce receives nourishment from the ground under the water. Therefore, it's considered produce grown in Eretz Yisrael, which is mechuyev in maiser and shmita. Although the actual soil in which the produce grows is not from Eretz Yisrael, it's considered produce of Eretz Yisrael, since it gets nourishment from the ground of Eretz Yisrael. This applies only if the boat has a hole in it, because that's going to be like an otzitz nakov, right? The hole is filled with clods of earth to prevent the water from coming in. In such a case, the nutrients of the riverbed pass through the hole and reach the produce. However, if it's not nakov, if there's no hole, the produce is pot from Ma'aser and Shemitah, because the ship will block the nutrients from reaching the produce. Rabbi Yehuda says, Amosai, when are we talking about? When the bottom of the boat is touching the ground beneath the water. In such a case, the produce in the boat draws nourishment from the ground. However, if the bottom of the boat is not touching the ground, the produce does not draw nourishment from the ground. In such a case, it's not considered to be growing in Eretz Yisrael, therefore it's pater from Meiser and Shemitah. As is Mavur and Rashi and Gittin. The Tanna Kama, however, disagrees and holds that the Paris do get nourishment even though the boat is not touching the ground. Therefore, the produce is going to be mechuyev in Meiser and Shemitah. Okay, back to Hilchas Chala. Isa sheni lo yishe b'mei Paris, though that was needed with fruit juice, apple juice, or orange juice. Chayeves b'chala. Fruit juice refers to any juice except the zayin mashkim, which are mentioned in Machshirim, which make things mukhshal kabel tuma, which is tal, mayim, yayin, shemen, dam, cholov, and dvash. Yad, shochad, dam, that's the way that we remember it, these 7 mashkes. So Isa sheni lo yishe b'mei Paris chayeves b'chala, because fruit juice can bond the separate pieces of flour together to form dough. I mean, just because it's made of fruit juice is not an exemption. The Mishnah in Tvul Yoim brings a machlekes regarding the status of dough made of fruit juice. Rabbi Kiva holds that such dough is not considered one entity, but a collection of many particles of flour. He says because the fruit juice lacks significance, and therefore the separate pieces of flour are not considered to be combined together. Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda, however, holds that fruit juice can combine the flour into dough. While the Mishnah here deals with Hilchas Tumah, this machlekes will also affect the Hilchas Chala as well, since one dough is mechuyev in Chala, and if you have many pieces, it's not going to be mechuyev. Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh De'ah in Shin Chav Tes paskins that nowadays one should avoid kneading a dough purely of fruit juice. Since in our time challah is not eaten by kahanim, we're faced with the question how to get rid of the challah. Now, when challah is tameh, that like normally challah would be in our days, the halacha is that it's burnt. However, food can become tameh only if it was at some point made wet with one of the zayin mashkes. So challah made of pure fruit juice, however, does not become tameh and may not be burnt. Therefore, in order to avoid this issue, some water or another one of the zayin mashkim should be added to the dough in order to make it mukhshal kabel tumah, in order to be able to burn it and get rid of it. It's a very interesting thing. A dough that was kneaded with mei peris may be eaten with unwashed hands, because dough made with fruit juice cannot become tameh. Food can only become tameh if it was made wet with one of the zayin mashkim, as we mentioned before. So if someone didn't wash his hands, eats the challah of the dough, it doesn't become tameh since it was kneaded with fruit juice. Since there's no concern of the challah becoming tameh, the kohen does not need to wash his hands before eating it. Mishnah Gimel. Ha'isha yesheves v'koytza chalosa aruma mepnei shehi yechayla l'chasis atma. Before separating challah, we're mechuyev to make a bracha. Asher kishjonim v'mitzvaysa v'tzivan l'hafresh challah. Some say l'hafresh challah min ha'isa, but that's the bracha. So one whose erva is uncovered may not recite the bracha. The Mishnah discusses whether a woman who's not wearing clothing may separate challah. A woman may sit on the ground and separate her challah unclothed. She is able to cover herself. She can sit in a way that her erva is covered, therefore she can recite the bracha and separate challah. The Mishnah refers to a case where the woman is sitting, so she will be completely covered. The person who's not clothed may not separate challah, since he will not be able to make the proper bracha. The Mishnah teaches that a woman who's not dressed may separate challah as long as she sits in the manner as described before, because her erva will not be exposed. But this is not the case with the man. A man may not separate challah while unclothed, even if he's sitting, because a man's private area will be exposed even if he sits in this way, which will answer him from reciting a bracha, because it's also to make a bracha in front of an erva. Therefore, he may not separate challah in such a case. Meaning that to do the mitzvah, it seems like it's okay. The shaila is here. The shaila here is dafka making a bracha in front of the erva, which, if you look at the beginning of Sefta Trumas, we discussed this also about the people who can't separate. That they're lo yitram avalim tarim shemasei truma. It's very much negea the possibility of making a bracha. The Mishnah goes back to the Hilchas, the Chiyuv of Challah. Misha eni yachal lasas yisase betara. While kneading the dough that has the Chiyuv Challah, one has to be careful that it shouldn't become tameh, because if the dough becomes tameh, the challah will also become tameh, and it's usher to cause the challah to become tameh. So Misha eni yachal lasas yisase betara. Someone can't make his dough betara because he's tameh and there's no mikveh available. If a tameh person touches the dough that becomes tameh, he's therefore mechuyev to go to a mikveh before kneading the dough, so that the dough and its challah should remain tahor. In our case, however, there's no mikveh available, so the dough he needs will become tameh. So yasen a kabin. He should make the dough in kav portions, which each portion is being smaller than the minimum amount of a chiyuv challah, v'al yasen a betuma, and he may not make it in a state of tumah. That is, he may not need a dough that's large enough to be mechuyev in challah to separate challah from a betuma. This is usher, because the dough that will be tameh, he'll be mechuyev to separate challah even though he'll make it tameh. Since it's also to make the challah tameh, he must avoid the chiyuv challah entirely by making the dough in smaller portions, that there wouldn't be a chiyuv of challah here either. In a regular situation, a person may not divide dough into smaller parts in order to pater himself up from challah. Nevertheless, in this case, it's mutter to do so in order to avoid the isser of causing the challah to become tameh. So it's better to pater yourself from challah than to make it betuma. Rabbi Kiva says, Yasena betuma val yasena kabin. Rabbi Kiva says he should make it in a state of tumah, but not make it in kav portions to pater yourself up from the chiyuv of challah. For just as one designates a challah for tahor, so too one can designate challah for tamei dough. Regarding the tahor, though, he signs the name challah, and regarding the one that's tamei, it's also challah when it was separated. So what are we talking about over here? The method for separating challah is the same whether the challah is tahor or tamei. In either case, the owner separates a piece of challah and says harezu challah. We see that just as challah separated from tahor has kedusha, so too challah separated from tamei though also has some level of kedusha. The Torah refers to challah as a chelik l'Hashem, which shows that challah has kedusha. Since challah that's tamei is also separated, it's still called challah, so it doesn't lose its kedusha even if it becomes tamei. It's very interesting, because ba'atzim you would say that if it's kaddish, then the kedusha would knock out the tumah, or vice versa. Aval kabim ein lehem chelik b'Hashem. Kav portions, on the other hand, where you wouldn't be mechayiv yourself on challah, there's no challah separated from it. It's more important to have a portion of one's dough sanctified for Hashem than to prevent the challah from becoming tamei. Therefore, he should make one large dough, even though the challah will be tamei, because by doing so, there would be a portion that will still be kaddish. Mishnah Dalet. Ha'isa isasei kabim. The Mishnah is going to discuss halach in a case we have two doughs, each one smaller than the chiv of challah, but they're touching each other. Someone makes his dough in kav portions. He makes two separate doughs. One measures only a kav, which is less than the 1 1/4 kav minimum that's mechuyev in chalav, and no guzeh, and the two doughs are touching each other, and together they have the minimum amount that's mechuyev in chalav. P'tur min hachala ad sheyoshoichu. The halacha is that they're parted from the chiv of challah until the yoshoichu means until they bite each other, which means until they get so close to each other that they're pressed so firmly together that if one was separate the two doughs, a piece of one dough would be pulled along with the other dough. Those that are merely touching each other, however, do not combine to form one dough. Since each dough by itself is parted from challah, the doughs remain parted from challah. Rabbi Lezer Omer, af haroid of enosin lasal, hasal mitzar from lachallah. Rabbi Lezer says, if one baked 2 kav-sized doughs and removes them from the oven, and then places the finished bread in a basket, hasal mitzar from lachallah, the basket combines them to be mechuyev and challah. Since both breads together contain the amount necessary to be mechuyev and challah, they are mechuyev and challah, meaning that it sounds like he made 2 separate doughs, but then he puts them together in a basket, so that's enough to be mechayev in challah. What's the svar over here? Rabbi Lezer is talking about even if they're not biting each other. The fact that they're in one basket combines them. Rabbi Lezer learned this halacha from a pasuk. However, even according to Rabbi Lezer, the breads must at least be touching each other, and if not, the basket will not combine them. It's interesting halacha. The Tanna Kama, however, disagrees and holds that only those that bite each other can combine. However, being in the same basket does not combine them, even if they are touching each other. Mishnah Hey. Hamafresh challah se kemach ein challah. If someone separates his challah from flour, the halacha is it's not challah because challah must be taken from dough. If it's not taken from dough, but it's taken from flour, it's not good. The gezel biad kohen. If he gives this challah to a kohen, it's considered stolen goods in the hand of the kohen must return it. Min Torah, the kohen is not mechuyev to return the flour. Although the challah is no good, and the owner must separate challah again, as the Mishnah will say, the kohen can claim that the owner gave it to him as a matana. Right? There's nothing wrong if he gave him matana to the kohen. However, the chacham were concerned that the owner might think that he was yaitzi's chiyuv of challah with the flour. Therefore, in order to make it clear to him that he wasn't yaitzi's chiyuv of challah, so they said it's gezel biad kohen and he has to give it back. The dough itself that the owner needs from the rest of the flour is still mechuyev challah, since the challah separated from the flour was no good. So the owner must separate another chiyuv of the owner must separate challah again from the dough. Regarding the challah flour that was given to the kohen, if it has the shear of 1 1/4 kavim, it's mechuyev challah. Although there's normally no chiyuv to separate challah from the portion of challah given to a kohen, here the flour is not actually challah. Therefore, the dough needed from this flour is going to be mechuyev like any other flour, vasur lazarim, and all the flour that was originally given to the kohen as challah is going to be asur lazarim. Although the flour is not challah, the chachamim asked to give it to a non-kohen as if it were challah. Did Rabbi Yeshua? This is the svar of Rabbi Yeshua. So the Rav points out something interesting here. He says this chamesh from kemach that we're talking about over here, that's mechuyev and chalav asur lazarim. Kol hakemach shabol yad kohen. All this flour that he gave to the kohen v'chumra bi'almahu Lefisha rosh abol yad kain shlo yomer re'inu zar echel chalas. If we'll see a zar eating from this flour, they'll think that there is a type of matnas kahuna that's made of that's a matana of flour, and he gave it to the kohen, and now we see that a zar is eating it. Oh, so zarim are allowed to eat challah, zarim are allowed to eat non-kahanim are allowed to eat matnas kahuna. That and people might start eating. It's a shtugal marzayin issue over here. So shalayomer people shouldn't say re'inu zar. We saw a non-kain eating chalas. In order to prevent that from happening, we say that this whole flour business is going to be usher to a non-kain. Amrullah, the Chacham said. The Chacham said to Rabbi Yeshua, "Ma'isa kvasha zakein zar." There's an incident where challah was separated from flour, and a zakein, who was a Talmud Chacham, an older person, and he ate it. And he proves that non-kahanim. This proves that non-kahanim may eat such a challah. The owner of the flour separated the flour as challah and gave it to a kohen. Since the Mishnah paskin previously that the kohen must return such challah, this Talmud Chacham had the right to grab it. This is evidently speaking of a case where the Talmud Chacham himself was the original owner, or he grabbed it with the owner's permission, because then with Stam there'd be a problem of taking something that's not his. Rabbi Yeshua said to them, "Afu kilkala atba v'tikala acherim." This Talmud Chacham, in fact, ruined matters for himself. The Torah scholar, this Talmud Chacham, actually committed something wrong by eating the challah, and he was punished for it. V'tikala acherim. Nevertheless, he fixed the matter for the other people who would eat such challah, because they base their actions on what Talmud Chacham do. So he didn't do it bedavka. At any rate, this Talmud Chacham acted incorrectly, and no proof can be brought from his actions. Rabbi Yeshua responded that while this Talmud Chacham was a learned person and could be relied on for halachic matters, in this particular case he made a mistake and thought that it's permitted to eat the flour separated as challah. However, in truth, it is aser. Mishnah Vav. 5 revoim of flour are mechuyev in challah. If the flour, the sourdough, the fine bran, and the coarse bran equal 5 revoim, it's mechuyev and challah. Sourdough counts towards the share of challah because it's a normal ingredient added to the dough. The bran, whether the suban, whether the morsan, the fine or the coarse bran count because they're found in bread eaten by poor people. So they're also considered part of the dough. However, if the coarse bran was removed from the chameches ram and then put back in, they're parted from the chiyuv of challah because even poor people don't add bran to the dough when making the bread. So such bran is not a normal ingredient in the dough and cannot count towards the shir of challah. Since even poor people don't add bran to the dough, the bran cannot be considered part of the dough to create a chiyuv of challah. Fine. Mishnah Zayin. Shir hachala echad me'esan ve'arba. The minimum amount that a private person must give as challah is a 24th of the dough. This is because the portion one gives as challah must be a significant amount. The Torah says one must give challah, so it should be a respectable gift, and less than 1/24 of a small dough is not significant. Moreover, if one makes a small amount of dough for himself or a large amount of dough for his son's chasana, he must separate 1/24 of challah. Since a private person generally makes a small dough, the chachamim were misaken that the amount should be 1/24 for all privately made dough. So even if a private person prepares a large amount of dough, he must still separate 1/24. A baker who makes dough to sell in the market, or a woman who makes a dough to sell in the market, he separates 1/48 of the dough as challah. A baker usually makes a large amount of dough, therefore even 1/48 of such dough is a significant gift. Even a woman who makes a smaller dough to sell may separate only 1/48 because the Chacham has set this as a sheer minimum of challah that's going to be sold. If a woman was making bread for her family and her dough became tameh by accident, she mistakenly used a keli that was tameh, or because of an unavoidable circumstance, she became a nida while she was making the dough. She separates only 1/48 instead of 1/24, as we mentioned before, that the that we try to minimize tumah when it comes to challah. This is because challah that's tameh may not be eaten; it must be burnt. So the chacham were mekel and allowed her to separate a smaller amount of challah. Nitmis mezida. However, if the dough became tameh intentionally, rather than by shaygeg or by einus, echad me'asr v'arba, she must separate 1/24 as challah kadesh le'chaytei niskar, so that the sinner should not gain because of her sin. If she would have been b'shaygeg, or she would have been an einus, the dough would have been tahor, and if she wouldn't have done it b'mezid, the dough would have been tahor, and the tahor dough made in private is subject to the amount of 1/24. So she would have been mechuyev to give 1/24 as challah. Therefore, although the dough is now tameh, she must still separate 1/24, so she should not benefit because of the avera. Mishnah Ches. Rabbi Lezer Oimer nitelas minatar ala tameh. Dough that you're being mafresh as challah must be close to the dough and needs to be minamukaf. So the reason for this, tahor dough, tahor dough may not be designated as challah for tameh dough. The chacham were concerned that someone who designates tahor dough as challah for tameh dough might not bring the dough being designated as challah close to the tameh dough because it might touch. So so they were geyser that it's also to be mafresh. It's nit Rebbe Lezer Emini tell us minatar al tameh. Challah may be taken from tahor dough from tameh dough. We're not concerned that people will be afraid that the challah will come tameh and not bring the dough being designated as challah close to the tameh dough. Normally, we could say that if the dough that's being designated as challah is near the dough for which it's designated, they don't have to touch each other. However, when tahor dough is being separated as challah for tameh dough, the two pieces must be touching each other. Rebbe Lezer will explain how the two doughs can touch without the challah becoming tameh. So let's work this out. Ketzad, how could you make a case where the challah separated? How could you separate this challah without it becoming tameh? Isa tahira v'isa tameh. If someone has a tahor dough and a tameh dough and wants to designate a portion of the tahor dough as challah, for both doughs he does like this. Neitel kedei challah. He takes a portion of the dough that's large enough for challah, and me'isa shleihorma chalasa from the tahor dough, if it has not yet had challah separated from it. And then he places a different piece of the tahor dough that's less than the shear of a kebeya between the two doughs, touching both of them. This piece of dough acts as a bridge connecting the two doughs. Then he places the portion of dough that will be designated as challah on the bridge. Meaning he makes a flat piece of dough, and then he puts another shear on top of that. So he'll be taking challah from something that's close to the doughs. Since the bridge joins the tahor and tameh doughs together, the challah is considered to be close and to actually be touching the tameh dough. Nevertheless, the challah doesn't become tameh because it's touching the bridge, not the tameh dough. So it's touching something that's touching the tameh dough, and the tameh will not be conducted through the bridge. So that piece that's sitting on the bridge is going to be okay. The chachamim aser separating tahor dough as challah for tameh dough, even with a bridge. The chachamim hold that people might be afraid that the tahor dough will touch the tameh dough directly and become tameh, and they would therefore designate challah without setting up a bridge. Therefore, the chachamim or mechayev the challah be separated from the tameh dough itself. Ad kan.